I can tell you that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And the people who are, some of the people who are part of the problem have just abandoned the church and given up on it. Well, I don't operate that way. Is the church a lost cause? No, it's not a lost cause. We need to reform the church. And yes, it's hard work. And no, it's not particularly pleasant. But we need to be faithful in our calling before God and be part of the solution. So hopefully this will start the process in your life and provide you with some foundation upon which to build. Now I'll give you a website address now, because I usually forget at the end to do so, where you can go and get a lot more information about what I'm going to talk about today. And this is a valuable information resource for your pastors, deacons, elders, your church and ministry leaders. You can send them to this website. And we found this to be a very effective educational tool. In addition, we've got some books, we've got some videos as well. Get those in the hands of the pastors, loan them out, pass them around. Again, be part of the solution. Paimon mentioned that the clergy played an important role. I'm going to underscore that point and, in fact, embellish it considerably by telling you this. Based upon my read of history, and I've spent a lot of time studying American colonial history, I can tell you that had it not been for the nonconformist clergy, and that's what King George called the clergy. In fact, he used a lot of polemics against them. He called the Black Regiment. The Black Regiment. They were called the Black Regiment. He mocked them because of the black robes that they wore. And by the way, people today make fun of judges and so forth wearing robes, and they call them dresses. That's really a misunderstanding. A black robe is a sign of authority. And it actually originated with the clergy many years ago. And it was the people who insisted that the clergymen wear the black robe. And in colonial America, most of the clergy wore the black robe. And most of the congregants referred to their pastor as reverend. Sir, I'm sorry, but I do not have time to take questions. But I'm happy to talk with you afterwards. Most of the clergy were called reverend by their parishioners. And the reason is because the term means a revered one, reverend. Now, there are a lot of clergymen today who are called reverend, like Reverend Jesse Jackson. It's a term that he's a very self-righteous man, and he just took that to himself. Nobody else started calling him reverend, other than, of course, the liberal media loves to call him reverend. They revere him, don't they? But so these are good things. It was a good thing that the clergy wore these black robes because the congregation insisted upon it, and they revered their pastors. These were men that were highly esteemed. Clergy today are by and large mocked, oftentimes by even their own parishioners. But it wasn't always that way. The clergy were the most highly esteemed, most influential men of their day. And I'm here to tell you that had it not been for the clergy, there would have never been a Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence came about and was insisted upon by the black-robed regiment, as King George called them. And you have to study the statements and the writings of the monarchy and the British Parliament to gain an appreciation for how much they feared the black-robed regiment. They were terrified of them. So I don't have time to go into that today, but I'll simply tell you that given that America was brought about as a free and independent Christian republic by a godly, determined, uncompromising clergy, my position has long been that, friends, if we do not address this issue of our churches being subordinated to the state in America, then I don't believe there's really a whole lot of hope of restoring America to her former glory. So, we're here at a freedom conference. We're here about personal freedom, and we've heard about some health freedom. I'm here to talk about some spiritual freedom through our churches becoming free churches as they once were. John Adams, our second president, who also first served as vice president under George Washington. And by the way, I was highly motivated to start this study years ago as a direct result of finding out from my father when I was adult. I don't know why he didn't tell me as a child, but he told me one day, the reason he didn't tell me is my father was one of the most humble men that ever lived, and unfortunately I didn't gained that attribute from my father. I'm not a humble man as he was, but my father was such a humble man. He never wanted to be viewed as one who bragged about himself. So he was embarrassed to tell me that he was the 8th cousin to George Washington. And I was astonished by that. And I said, so what does that make me? And so I wasn't humbled by that. I thought, wow, that's really cool. And I started reading the writings of George Washington, and I was absolutely astonished at how many letters he wrote to clergymen. You realize over half of the letters that Washington wrote during the War for Independence were to clergymen. He knew who the clergymen were. He knew the influence they had in their local communities, and it was to him to them that he always turned for support, because he knew he could count on it, and he knew they were the ones who would deliver the men, the munitions, the supplies, the moral, the spiritual support. These were very significant men in their influence, and it's largely through the writings of Washington and others that I've gained this understanding. John Adams, who served as Washington's vice president and was our second president, stated the church, am I in anybody's way here? I'll step down here. The church is the moral compass of society. Well, friends, there are a number of theologians who have spoken of the effects of what happens when the church fails to be the prophetic voice, and that's a proper theological term. The church is a prophetic voice to the culture. And men such as R.J. Rushdoony have made the statement that when the church gets a cold, the culture gets pneumonia. And this is what's happened. As goes the church, so goes the culture. As goes the church, so goes the family. And our families and our culture are in the sorry state of affairs that they are in today because the church is no longer being the prophetic voice, or, as John Adams stated, the moral compass. It's no longer being the moral compass to the culture and to our families. It's not being the support that it needs to be. Well, of course, there are many reasons for this, but I believe that this problem, if we look back historically, when did this start happening in a significant way? When did the church lose its prophetic voice? Now, there are other Christian historians, of which I am a Christian historian. You know who they are, I suspect. You may have their videotapes. You may have heard what they have to say. And many of the things they have to say are true, but unfortunately, they've drawn the wrong conclusions. And therefore, they're part of the problem. They're not part of the solution. Now, they say some really good things, and it sounds good, and it motivates us, but some of the things they say are really stupid, like the problems in America started when God was kicked out of the public schools. Well, friends, if you have studied the history of public education, you already know that the entire institution is thoroughly unbiblical, it is thoroughly anti-Christian, and the men who promulgated it, such Horace Mann and John Dewey, were in some cases Unitarian, therefore they denied the deity of Christ, and in many other cases were atheists. And their objective in bringing this Prussian school system, which was designed by King Frederick II, his agenda, as he told his kingly court, is to create within one generation a servile, docile, non-thinking citizenry. Sit down, fill out the forms, and shut up. And that's what we have today in America. And therefore, this is an idiotic conclusion to say that, oh, the problems in America happened because God got kicked out of the public schools. As though putting him back in the public schools is going to fix anything. That's not the solution. Friends, the problem goes back a little bit further. Maybe not much further, but the problem actually goes back shortly after the turn of the 20th century, when the church denominations, on the whole, en masse, at the instigation of their board of directors and significant corporate moguls who sat on the board of directors, such as Andrew Carnegie, encouraged these denominations to incorporate. They didn't do so for any of the reasons that we hear today. They did so because these were industrial men, and they liked the efficiencies of the corporation. They liked the corporate infrastructure, and they viewed it as much more efficient than biblical church polity. And that's the reason they incorporated, and then the member churches, by example, they followed the lead of the denominations, and now incorporation is the status quo. Now, I'm going to emphasize this morning incorporation, and then I'm going to finish up with a 501c3. Most of you believe, or that's an assumption, many people believe the problem's the 501c3, and you're wrong about that too. The problem's incorporation. That's the legal foundation upon which churches are organized today. 501c3 is a symptom of the problem. It makes a big problem worse, definitely. But don't focus on something that isn't the root cause. We need to address the root cause of the problem. So I've asked this question of hundreds and hundreds of clergymen over the years. Pastor, has the church been gagged? Now, unfortunately, I wouldn't recommend that you ask pastors this, at least until a last resort. You just come right out and you ask a pastor, have you been gagged? You will offend him and have the door slammed in your face, and he'll never want to talk to you again. So you need to introduce the subject with some good manners, some etiquette, and not cause offense before it's necessary to do so. However, although there have been many, many pastors who've denied this, they're offended. They say, oh, my church hasn't been gagged. I say anything I want to from my pulpit. And my response is, well, preacher, are you? Are you addressing the vital issues of the day? Well, what do you mean? Well, when's the last time you talked about the 4,000 babies that are going to be murdered today and every day in America? When's the last time that you addressed the sodomite agenda? When is the last time that you talked about money from the Bible? Money? Well, there are very few pastors who do that, and I have to ask them, preacher, I don't understand. Don't you know what money is? And of course they don't. Don't you know, preacher, that the Bible addresses the subject of money 10 times more often than even the subject of faith? Now, this doesn't make money 10 times more important than faith. No, it doesn't. But I dare say that if a subject is addressed that frequently in the Bible and the preacher never talks about it, we've got a problem. He's not teaching the whole counsel of God, as Paul admonished Timothy. You must teach the whole counsel of God. And so therefore, a lot of clergymen are not addressing the vital issues of the day. Why not? Well, push comes to shove, and you get an honest preacher, he's going to admit he's afraid of the government. He doesn't understand all the details legally, but he understands that they have this status with the government and that there are certain rules, strings attached to the privilege. And if he violates the terms and conditions, they could lose the benefit, you see? And so, is there any freedom of religion? Is there any freedom of speech from the pulpits today? Not if they have those strings attached. There isn't. Does that disturb most clergymen? No, and that's sad. But there is a clergyman who has had the moral integrity to acknowledge this problem. His name is Dr. D. James Kennedy. I wouldn't call Kennedy a televangelist because that's got kind of a pretty negative connotation and perhaps well-deserved, but he's a television preacher. He's a preacher who happens to televise his sermons. And he acknowledged in an interview in 1996 that he has been gagged. And see what he says here. He says, we are not saved by government or politics, and my basic press toward government is not to get them to save America, but to get them out of the way. The federal government has proved a tremendous impediment to the ongoing work of Christians. In all the laws that they have passed against Christian schools, gagging the church, there you have it, taxation and all kinds of things that they have done, they have made it harder for the church to exercise its prerogatives and to preach the gospel. The government today is doing its very best to block that advancement in so many ways. Take the last presidential election. He's talking about when Clinton won the election in '96. There were numbers of things that I knew that I was never able to say from the pulpit, because if you advance the cause of one candidate or impede the cause of the other, you can lose your tax exemption. Ah, there we have it. So you were gagged. You can't do that. The IRS, a branch of our government, has succeeded in gagging Christians. Well, big admission on his part, but the wrong conclusion. Wrong conclusion. Isn't it the easiest thing to do for all of us? And we're probably all guilty of this at one time or another. we point the accusatory finger at the government. And they're so easy to accuse, aren't they? Because they are guilty of a lot. But that doesn't mean they're guilty of everything. And the IRS is not guilty of what Dr. Kennedy accuses them of. Who do you suppose is the guilty party? Okay, specifically though, who told Dr. Kennedy he needed to be a 501c3? No, not the IRS. The IRS has never told any preacher you need to be a 501c3. It's never happened. Not politics. Okay, this man got it. The attorneys. The attorneys. Could I tell an attorney joke? I don't have time. Let's give credit where credit is due, friends. It's the attorneys. They're the ones responsible for doing this. Now, if you do as I did many years ago and you call the proper agency, the proper division within the IRS, which is called the Exempt Organizations Office, based out of Washington, D.C., and talk to the top guy, as I have. Call back repeatedly. Talk to everybody in the office. You know, this is a very different office within the IRS. If you call the IRS and you have a tax question and you call 10 times, you'll get 11 different answers. But you will get the same answer every single time you call the EO office. And I'll explain that here shortly. The attorneys are actually lying and telling the pastor they need something that the IRS has told them they don't need to have. So don't blame the government about this one. It's not their fault, as much as I would like to blame them. Now, Baron de Montesquieu in 1748 wrote a publication called The Spirit of the Laws. Could I see a show of hands of those familiar with and or who have read The Spirit of the Laws? Not one? You have got to be kidding me. Friends, are you... Boy, we need to be doing our history research one time. One gentleman. Public schools, yes. Well, I went to the public school system too, ma'am. I did. I didn't learn anything whatsoever from public schools. I didn't learn how to read until I was 25. I was a functional illiterate for many years. The Spirit of the Laws, friends, I'll give you, based upon what was cited and quoted and referred to by the framers of the founding documents, what was the publication that was cited more than any other publication? The Bible. Good. Boy, that's good. We know that. The second publication, Blackstone's Commentaries. The third publication, The Spirit of the Laws. This is the most brilliant treatise that has ever been authored on the political doctrine of the separation of powers. And of course, we know that and Montesquieu was an anti-monarchist. And he believed in republics, and he believed in separating powers. Why? Because, who stated this? I just had a mental slip here. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton made that statement. Power corrupts men, just like money corrupts the hearts of some men. So, as Cotton Mather, the Puritan clergyman, stated back in about 1670, he said, "Never entrust a man with more power than you are content for him to use, for use it he will." It's good counsel. And so, based upon the counsel of the clergymen and men such as Montesquieu, our government was divided into three branches. I think it would have been wise to divide more than that, probably, but in any event, that was a good move, and if that principle were followed to this very day, we would have a checked government. Montesquieu has a chapter in The Spirit of the Laws, very interestingly enough, and brilliant insight on the part of this man about religion and the power of religion. He believed that the church was the fourth branch of government, that their influence was so great. Now, he was in France, he was a Frenchman, and he saw how by merging the church and the state, both institutions had become incredibly corrupt. He believed it was very important to keep the church and the state separate and independent from one another. And notice what he says here, tongue-in-cheek, but brilliant insight. He says, a more certain way to attack religion is by favor, by the comforts of life, by the hope of wealth, not by what reminds one of it, but by what makes one forget it. Not by what makes one indignant, but by what makes men lukewarm. When other passions act on our souls, and those which religion inspires are silent. In the matter of changing religion, state favors are stronger than penalties. Friends, that's exactly what's happened. Now, the tyranny in America today is far more sophisticated than the tyranny in Red China. Far more sophisticated. You see, they haven't come with a bayonet pointed in our face and said, "You will submit." No, they've come with privileges and benefits. You see? And it's good being a slave. There's all kinds of wonderful benefits to being a slave. I mean, look at what happened to the Hebrew children. You know, within days after they were liberated from their slavery in Egypt, what were they doing? They were complaining to Moses and saying, "We don't like being free men. We like the leeks and the onions and the garlic and the flesh pots of Egypt." See, Egypt was a very sophisticated welfare state, the most sophisticated welfare state that had ever existed up until that point in time. They had state education, state health care. They had the safety nets for people who'd been injured on the job. You know, it wasn't the way it's portrayed by Charlton Heston as Moses and in the Ten Commandments. No, it wasn't that way. Slavery wasn't a great life, but it was secure. And men are willing to often trade their liberty for security, are they not? Well, Montesquieu's insight is a good reminder to us in terms of what's happened to the church by acceptance of state favors. It's compromised the church. It has subordinated the church to the state. So, here's our first portion here, and the next portion, the final portion, will be the symptom of the problem, which is 501c3. Let's address the real problem here, and I will posit this question, WWJ Inc. I hope I don't offend anybody here, but I frankly hate those WWJD bracelets and keychain fobs and sunglasses, neck holder things, and I hate a lot of this ridiculous Christian marketing. It makes me sick to my stomach to go into a Christian bookstore, so I seldom do. But the question, what would Jesus do, is irrelevant. We shouldn't speculate about what kind of a car Jesus would drive today. We need to ask the question, what did Jesus do, and therefore what must we do? That's the proper question. Would Jesus incorporate his church? I spoke, for those of you who were here a little earlier this morning, I addressed this issue. The church was not incorporated in ancient Rome, even though it was legally required. And that, friends, is the first and foremost reason why the church was held in a state of civil disobedience. And unlike civil disobedience in America, where we have a proud tradition of it, and provided it's peaceful, civil disobedience is protected by the Constitution. Now, civil disobedience in Rome was a capital offense. You complied with the state edicts, or you might get crucified. And the early church refused to incorporate. And there are significant theological reasons why. Now, President James Madison, coming forward a little bit more in history, understood this principle of what happens when the state incorporates a church. And to set this up historically for you, in 1811, the Protestant Episcopal Church, which had formerly been the Anglican Church, remember we gained our independence, and this left the Anglican Church in the American, now the American states, in a bit of a quandary because they didn't understand who's going to be our sovereign head anymore. See, in Anglicanism you've got these sovereigns. And interestingly enough, the king is the Lord sovereign head of the Church of England. Did you know that? It's that way to this very day. That started with Henry VIII in 1547 when he separated the Church of England from the Church of Rome. The Pope had been the Church of Rome and therefore the Church of England. Well, who's going to be the new king? Well, the king and the monarch in his arrogance said, "Oh, that's me. That sounds like a job for me." Now, had he been a godly man, he, of course, would have acknowledged, "Oh, of course, that position can go to no other than the Lord Jesus Christ." But Henry wasn't a very godly man, nor were hardly any of the English monarchs, so he in his arrogance declared himself through what was called the Oath of Assent to be the supreme Lord Sovereign Head of the Church. And friends, that started a war in the American colonies. It started a war. It also started a war in England with the Scottish Covenanters. There were many godly clergymen who said, "You are a blasphemer, King! Only Jesus is the sovereign head of the church." And many of those clergymen came to America's shores as well. Now, when the Protestant Episcopal Church, now being separated from its moorings in England, with the state Anglican Church, they didn't know who could be their sovereign head. Again, if they had been smart, they would have just said, "Oh, Jesus could be our sovereign head." Wouldn't that be biblically consistent? But no. They somehow didn't have their thinking caps on. They didn't know the Bible. And so they reasoned that, the state is sovereign over all corporations. So that would be consistent with our beliefs. Since we're statists anyway, we believe the king is our Lord Sovereign Head. Well, he can't be our king in this free and independent Christian republic known as America. So we'll have the state be our head through the corporation. And they petitioned Congress for a corporate charter, and it passed, amazingly enough. They got issued a corporate charter by the U.S. Congress, and it was heated debate, but a lot of the congressmen, for whatever reason, just weren't getting it. And so they issued the charter. The charter, of course, had to be signed by the president. James Madison vetoed the charter, and here is a portion of what he said in his veto message. He vetoed it because the bill exceeds the rightful authority to which governments are limited by the essential distinction between civil and religious functions, and violates in particular the article of the Constitution of the United States which declares that Congress shall make no law respecting a religious establishment. Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? Why don't clergymen see that today? You incorporate a church, that's a state establishment of religion. But they just don't get it today. They're just not getting it. The bill enacts into and establishes by law sundry rules and proceedings relative purely to the organization and polity of the church incorporated. This particular church, therefore, would so far be a religious establishment by law, a legal force and sanction being given to certain articles in its constitution and administration. Now, just prior to the Protestant Episcopal Church seeking a corporate charter from the U.S. Congress, they went to the state legislature in Virginia, where they were domiciled, specifically in Alexandria, and they sought a petition from the state legislature in Virginia. You know what Virginia did? They denied it to them, and they amended their state constitution to, quote-unquote, forever prohibit the incorporation of churches in Virginia. You realize that is the law of the land in Virginia to this very day? Law of the land. Irrespective of Jerry Falwell suing the state, don't get me started on Jerry Falwell. That's the law of the land. You cannot incorporate a church in Virginia today. Do you know how many churches are organized today? I had a gentleman ask me a valid question after he spoke earlier this morning. He said, "So if a church is incorporated, what is it?" I said, "A church." And his eyes glazed over. You see, this is how we just haven't been thinking about these issues. You see, a church actually is a legal status. However, the courts have stated for many years, that a church is not an entity recognized in law. Oh my, isn't that a terrible thing? No, it's not. What that is telling you is that the state has no jurisdiction over the church. Did you realize a church cannot be sued? I'm going to prove that to you here shortly. And yet attorneys will come in and say, "Oh, preacher, don't you know that, I looked at the Secretary of State's records, discovered your church isn't incorporated." And they put fear in the heart of the pastor. Now, fear sells, doesn't it? Let's scare people to buy what we're peddling. And the attorneys are really good at fear-mongering, aren't they? And so you could be sued, pastor. Your church could be sued. And since you're not incorporated, if a judgment is issued and a charging order is handed down, Not only can the plaintiff collect against the assets of the church, but you personally, the elders, the deacons, and every member of the church can be financially held accountable, and they'll just go after the deep pockets in the church. Now, I'm from Missouri. I'm from the Show Me State. You're from the Show Me State, sir, and that's how I operate. And I've had attorneys tell me that years ago. They don't say that to me anymore. And I say, show me. Show me one single example where that has ever happened. Again, the attorneys are lying. It's never happened. A church can't be sued. Now, if a priest, say for example, molests a child, could he be sued? Of course he can. Okay? Why is the Catholic Church being held accountable for the sins of these priests? It's a corporation, specifically in souls. By the way, someone's bound to ask me about the corporation soul, and I'll just tell you right now, a lot of the information that's being promulgated, primarily on the internet, you better think twice about it. It's what I commonly refer to as patriot mythology. The case law doesn't support it. The history doesn't support it. We've got an extensive review, and I wrote a legal brief on the corporation soul. It's on our website at hushmoney.org. Take a look at what I've put up there. I could probably make a huge amount of money if I wanted to peddle corporation souls, but I plan on standing before the judgment throne someday and giving an accounting for my life, and I know what's being promulgated about the corporation soul is absolute nonsense, and the Catholic Church is a classic example. Now, these priests should be held accountable, and if they have committed crimes like sexual assault against children, they ought to be thrown in jail, and I believe biblically much more should be done to their body parts as well. But if the Catholic Church weren't organized as a corporation soul, the state would have no jurisdiction over the churches. So it's actually exactly the opposite of what the attorneys are telling us. You see, what people are doing is they are attaching the assets of the church even though the sins are of the fathers. So jurisdictionally, what you're doing is you're actually placing your church, you're converting the legal status and standing from a church into something other than a church, and it's actually the corporation in the vast majority of cases that they're suing. They're not suing the church. Now, let's break down this interesting metamorphosis of church incorporated. What happens? Did you know there's a legal definition of church? Our ministry offers legal dictionaries, specifically very old-timey legal dictionaries. If you want to understand any subject, it's important to understand the words and phrases that are used in that particular topic. And when you're dealing with law, you may not necessarily always want to trust a modern law dictionary because they've been rewritten by attorneys, whereas we used to have legal counselors and advocates in America. But men such as Mr. Black and Mr. Bouvier, Mr. Anderson wrote some very fine law dictionaries years ago, but the current editions have been perverted. However, if I can quote from a current edition of a law dictionary and providentially it has a good definition, I'll do that. Because I want to be sure the attorneys who only have access to current dictionaries, hardly any of them have the old-timey dictionaries, that they can look it up for themselves. And the word church actually has a legal definition that's many centuries old that originated in English common law and actually originated even before that in Scotland. And the term church is an anglicized form of the Celtic word kirk. By the way, my name Kershaw, when I found this out years ago, I was really blessed to discover this, comes from the Scotch-Irish and anglicized name, and it comes from Kershaw, which literally means church guardian. I was kind of blessed by that. I thought, wow, that's providential. I guess it's consistent with my calling. Church, Inc. Legal definition, again, this actually comes from Old English Common Law. Church, in its most general sense, the religious society founded and established by Jesus Christ to receive, preserve, and propagate his doctrines and ordinances. Now, by the way, I believe in religious freedom. So if you're not a Christian, I don't think you ought to be booted out of America. I believe every person ought to have the right to practice the worship of whatever deity they worship, provided you're not, offering babies to Moloch through the fire or some crazy thing, or smoking peyote and calling, or ganja and saying, oh yeah, that helps me to worship God. Okay. But I think within reason, everybody ought to have the freedom to worship their deity. However, America was not established as a pagan nation. It was established as a Christian nation. And so when you look up words and you try and understand the etymology, the original intent behind the use of the language, you don't look at it in the current context, you look at it in the context of the men who originally wrote founding documents, for example. What did they mean by this word religion? Well, don't look up the word religion in the current Webster's. Go back to Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. Look up the definition that was current then, not what it's been changed into today. Now, what's happened today with the church is that you've got organizations that call themselves churches that don't in any way meet the criteria of this English common law definition, like the Church of Satan. Does that meet the criteria of a church? It does to the IRS. They qualify. By the way, did you know the Church of Satan is a corporation sole? Oh, there's a strong endorsement for you to go get your corporation sole. What about the Church of Scientology? I'm not saying you shouldn't be free to practice that if you want to. I don't know why you'd want to, but does that meet the criteria for being a church? It does according to the IRS. They're legally organized as incorporated 501c3, and the IRS classifies them as a church, but it doesn't meet the criteria. Therefore, Pastor, I think it's very misguided for you to say, we're going to be an incorporated 501c3 because we believe that helps legitimize us. Oh my goodness, I've heard that hundreds of times. Oh great, that's good legitimacy. You can hang out with your pals, the Church of Satan and the Church of whatever. Okay, that's good legitimacy. Now let's combine this with the legal definition. One of the legal definitions, granted this is very abbreviated, but I think it pretty much sums it up. An artificial person or legal entity created by or under the authority of the laws of a state. An association of persons created by statute as a legal entity. Well, can you start to see that we might have some conflicts here? Okay. Who is the head of the church? Jesus Christ. Who's the head of the corporation? The state. The state is the legal sovereign. The legal sovereign. Sovereign, definition, the supreme power, the supreme authority. And friends, there can be no higher authority than the supreme. Therefore, you can't incorporate a church and say, oh yeah, Jesus is still on his throne. Now, what you did was you dethroned Jesus and you declared the state to be your sovereign at law. It is unavoidable. Now, maybe you didn't do that in your heart, but you are making a public testimony to the world. And it's little reason that there's been a mass exodus from the institutional, industrial, mercantile state church system in America. We're rapidly heading toward a church system that's very much like the churches have been for centuries in Europe. How many of you have attended a church service anywhere in Europe? Okay. Did you have a wonderful, lively, spirit-filled? You did. You did. Sister, I need to talk to you because you're a rare exception. Now, my experience in my travels in Europe have been, if you want to be depressed, if you do not want to be joyful, if you do not want to glorify and honor God, attend the typical state church in anywhere in Europe. Okay? This is a church system that is dead. The church is virtually dead throughout Europe, and it's largely because it's a state church system. Now, what are the so-called benefits? Oh boy, again, the attorneys, they scare you, but boy, they've got the solution, don't they? Isn't that how our government operates? They create the problem, then they provide the solution for you. What are the benefits? Limited liability protection. Limited liability protection. That's the one that's always mentioned first by the attorneys. Well, I have to wonder about that, not only logically, certainly legally, but also theologically. I already told you the attorneys are wrong. The greatest form of protection that has ever been offered to any church at any time in history is the church in America. Why? The First Amendment. Who gave us the First Amendment? The clergy. They were the ones responsible for demanding that First Amendment. Just a little side note, do you know who's responsible for giving us the Second Amendment? The clergy! You have to read my book to appreciate why that was. You realize the vast majority of commanders who served under George Washington during the War for Independence were clergymen and church elders. The vast majority. You have to give me more time to talk about that. But these were significant men, and they significantly influenced our history. And we got a free and independent America because of them, and we've lost it also because, unfortunately, those traditions have not been properly passed down through the generations. Limited liability protection is a phantasm for several reasons. But, as I already told you, it becomes the nexus of jurisdiction that brings every church that I've ever seen get sued. It's not the church being sued, it's the corporation. And the church gets dragged in on its coattails. That's ridiculous. The First Amendment protects the church in a real legitimate fashion, whereas incorporation just simply brings all these churches into court. And now the attorneys don't sell this as a benefit. They don't talk about this. They're not providing full disclosure to their clients. Did you know that the second attribute of a corporation is it may sue and be sued? Whoa, isn't that a benefit? Boy. The attorneys, now that's a benefit to the attorneys, isn't it? It can also buy and sell real estate. See, attorneys say this all the time. Preacher, if you don't incorporate, the church can't hold title to real property. That is true. Why? Because a church is not an entity recognized in law. Therefore, it's not recognized by the courts, and you have to be recognized in law in some legal capacity to hold title to property. Well, all we have to do is go back in time to prior to the turn of the 20th century when churches started incorporating and ask the question, didn't they have church facilities? Didn't they have buildings? Who or what held title to them? See? Just go back and study the history. We can recover all of those things. This is what my ministry is doing. We're just simply saying, we're not that smart. You know, I've really been dumbed down by the public school. My fathers were probably a lot smarter than me, and things worked a lot better then. Jesus said you can know the tree by the fruit it produces. Let's look at the tree and the fruit it's producing today. It's a rancid bumper crop of fruit. The fruit was a lot better 100 and 200 years ago. It wasn't perfect. I'm not saying, that let's go back to the old days because there were no problems. There were problems, but certainly not the problems we have today. There's solutions for that as well. And then the attorneys lie and they say, oh, Pastor, if you don't incorporate, the only other choice is in an unincorporated association. Now, let me set this one up. Let's say, would you help me, young lady? Please, come on up here. Okay, now, and what's your name? Jenny. Okay. Jenny, stand at my, right in front of my station here. Okay. I'm your local government bureaucrat. Okay. And you are coming in to my office and you want to do something, and you're not sure what to do, but you come to me because I'm with the government and I'm here to help you. Okay? Now, you ask me a question, and my response is, oh, I can help you. What do you suppose the first thing is that I will help you with? How will I help you, or in what fashion?
By telling you what to do.
Okay, and how would I tell you what to do? What would I present you with? A form. A form. I'm going to give her a form. Honey, do you have a pen? Don't have a pen. Okay. We'll get a pen for you. Here, we got one right here. It's chained to the desk. This is a government pen, and they're very expensive, so we chain them down. And so I want to help you, and so take the pen and no, we've got the pen chained to the desk here, sir. Can't you see it? Can't you see it? You're not playing along with the Matrix here, okay? Now, so I would like for you to fill out the form. Now, do you notice all the check boxes there? Okay, so I want you to check some of those boxes. Now, box A, this is for a church. Box A is corporation, or box B is unincorporated association, okay? Would you please check one of those boxes? Okay? All right, thanks. All right, you get the point. You can sit down now. Thank you very much. Now, what am I doing to her? Choice A, choice B. Now, what do I do? And by the way, I believe it's very important that we have fun in life. You know, our God has a great sense of humor. And my wife will tell you, Peter Kershaw he has a very strange sense of humor. He has a very, he likes to do, one of the things he likes to do is get bureaucrats worked up in a lather. And this is one thing I love to do, is I love to modify the government form. And I do it for fun. You know? So, and sometimes when I travel, I'll say, well, hey, what can we, we may have a little time on our hands, and what should we do now, Peter? Well, let's go into a government office somewhere. Let's have some fun. Let's ask for something. Let's ask a question. We're presented with a form, and okay, I'll fill this out here, and they turn and they're doing their business. They come back, and I have added my own check boxes, and I've got different things, and they act like you committed a crime by modifying their form. Now, why are they upset? They're upset because what I have just done is to make a notorious declaration, that's the proper legal term, that I'm not in their jurisdiction. I'm not checking their boxes. I've got my own boxes I function within. And I've had bureaucrats tell me, very, very upset, you're just operating in the no man's land of jurisdiction. That's what they call it. I say, thank you very much. You just acknowledged I'm not in your jurisdiction. Okay? But I also correct them as it applies to the church. And I point out, I say, no, excuse me, but you see, I just wrote in here that Jesus Christ is the head. You see, it's not that I'm a law unto myself. God forbid. I'm not an anarchist. Our God is a God of law, and He's a God of order. He's not an anarchist. And so I'm not anti-government. I am just anti-tyranny. And I want you to understand who the head of our church is. It's not choice A or choice B. And see, the attorneys love to play along with that. Hi, I'm here to help you. We're going to put you within government jurisdiction. Well, you can easily guess why they like that. It's hard to get very many billable hours out of a free church. Free church needs an attorney like a fish needs a bicycle. All right, I'm going to have to probably close with this because we're rapidly running out of time. But I want to illustrate this point about the state not having jurisdiction over a church. And this is a very interesting case that was adjudicated very recently, 1981. And in this case, I'll tell you, the judge was absolutely amazed by this church. And notice what he says here. The State Street Baptist Church has been in existence for over 140 years. In 1973, the membership organized a nonprofit corporation. Once the church determined to enter the realm of Caesar, by forming a corporation, it was required to abide by the rules of Caesar, or in this case, the statutes of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Now, what is the judge saying there? What are you guys doing here in my court? You existed for 140 years as what? A church. See, the judge got it. He understood this principle, and he actually talked about it in this case. The court has no jurisdiction over a church. What are you guys doing here? You bunch of dummies? You reorganized to something that we have jurisdiction over. The judge didn't even want to hear this case. You realize judges hate it. Most of them hate seeing churches come before them. They get very annoyed by this. I've spoken with some judges that have had to try these incorporated church cases. They don't like it. They'd rather not have to deal with it. But the attorney talked them into taking state privileges and benefits. All right, I'm going to show you 2 more slides. Can I do that? Yes. Okay. Well, no, I'm not asking you folks. I've got to ask the host. He's nowhere to be seen. I guess, well, we'll just keep going here. Now, very quickly, 501c3. Again, the 501c3 is a symptom of the problem. Chris, I'm going to wrap it up real quick, okay? I promise. All right. And this is what happens. The church exchanges freedom of speech and freedom of religion for state pottage license, for the state pottage in the form of a license. Now, Where did we get the 501c3? Anybody happen to know? Or excuse me, who added the church to the 501c3 code section, and when did it happen? This gentleman knows? Very good. Someone does know. This gentleman right here. He did so in 1954. He sponsored the legislation. Again, know the tree by the fruit it produces. Analyze the legislation by the sponsor. This was no friend of the church. This was a man who hated the influence of the clergy because they had, early in his career, cost him a few elections. Again, the clergy used to have tremendous influence within the local community. Who did they go to first when they wanted to run for office? Well, like Sheriff Mack, they talked to the wife first, which is a smart move. Got to have the family support. Who did they go to next? Every time. The pastors in the local community. And it was a very common thing that the pastor, especially if he knew the man, had spent time with him, could vouch for his credentials and his ethics and his morals and so forth. They'd introduce the man from the podium, put their arm around him and say, I'm going to let you have the podium and I expect you to preach a sermon. You convince these people from your heart that you are the man to represent them. Lyndon Johnson hated the influence of the clergy. And he implicitly understood how easily a lot of the clergy would roll over for the privileges and benefits. So-called benefits, phantasm. Churches become tax exempt, contributions are tax deductible. And I'll simply end with this by saying, look at the public record. The IRS has never stated this. The IRS says exactly the opposite. I'll give you two publications, Publication 557, Publication 526. They will plainly tell you that a church is automatically tax deductible and automatically tax exempt. That's a half-truth. A church is non-taxable, okay? But that's a huge admission that the IRS admits. Pastor, you don't have to apply for 501c3 status. It's automatic. Why are they doing it? It's out of ignorance. It's not their fault. Don't get angry with them. How are they to know any better? The licensed professional comes in. He's the expert. He ought to know. They're going to defer to him. So, what's the solution? Well, it starts with you. This is a grassroots movement. So you need to be part of the solution. Talk to your pastor about that, but be gracious, please. I've heard a number of pastors tell me, oh yeah, I heard about this 501c3. Member of my church came in and got in my face and was really mad about it and called me names, and I don't ever hear about this again. Boy, you need to be planting seeds, okay? Not torching the fields, okay? Please, be considerate. Show some respect to these men, okay? I mean, maybe you just found out about this 10 minutes ago yourself. Don't go out and be arrogant. Be considerate and be respectful. And I have to close there, and I'm more than happy to take questions over here. Payman, thank you very much.